Hey guys, I want to start off with saying when I start to do project-based work, for instance, I've been working on that GTS Unsucking project for Windows 11, I might have stumbled across something that's probably pretty important to disclose. Now, I created a Reddit post a while back about whether or not this project should even continue, and I've gotten mixed reactions. I set the poll for 5 days, and once the poll completes, I'll actually disclose the information. But something that's a common occurrence inside the comments, at least, is about how people could just do this stuff themselves. So today I'd like to go over specifically what it is that the GTS Unsucking package actually does, the amount of changes that it requires you to do, and a pretty substantial, if not major, security flaw that would have found in Windows 11 as a result of going through it. Now, when it comes to actual security, and I mean security in the sense of the endpoint security, the Windows 11 security itself, this bug or flaw that I found in the operating system causes a pretty high risk for end users using the OS. However, it's not a security bug in the sense that Microsoft would call or Tenable would call a security flaw. In other words, it's not like a zero-day attack. It's nothing that you're going to be able to remotely access the system through. However, the disclosure of data that's your personal data to Microsoft, who just recently lost 38 terabytes of data to dark web hackers, and is unsure where it went. You know, the same company that's currently under investigation from the Federal Trade Commission about data leaking and security on their Azure cloud. That company has AI and other telemetry algorithms turned on in your Windows 11 operating system. That same company is basically using Windows 11 to legally spy on you. And you should have the option to opt out. However, that's where this major design flaw exists. Let's start here. Let's talk about the GTS Unsucking package itself, and specifically what that package does. And what I want to share with you guys is the full list of system-wide changes that need to take place on your actual operating system in order for us to secure the actual operating system. Now, as I'm talking to you, I'm actually scrolling down through the list of all of the changes that need to take place in your actual system in order to mimic any level of actual security. These security changes that I'm talking about, they range from actual security system changes that need to take place in order to actually secure the operating system. But then on top of that, security changes that need to take place in order to secure your data. In other words, make the system an offline system for you as the consumer to use on a daily basis without sharing everything that you do to the cloud. And the list is pretty much endless. There are approximately, I think, just shy of 10,000 lines of registry changes that need to take place in a Windows 11 operating system to make that Windows 11 operating system even remotely as secure for your personal data as Windows 7. However, I didn't stop there. I wanted to continue on this process. I wanted to actually lock down the system to the event that we're not talking about just Windows 7 security. We're talking about Windows 7 user interface interaction, meaning that your data is as secure as the user access for Windows 7 operating system. But we also wanted to secure the actual infrastructure or desktop configurations and the software installed on the desktop to make it so that way that the actual operating system itself is secure and not just an operating system that says, oh, it has security features built in. A lot of these changes that are in this actual script or this configuration, this registry change, are based on both the registry modifications necessary to apply group policy. Now, the reason why I use group policy to do this versus just traditional registry changes is because group policy is written to a local database. And that local database actually populates the data directly into the system variables, meaning that in the event you run an update or an upgrade or even a roll-up through a feature pack, these settings will still be retained in the registry. They don't go anywhere. Meaning that you don't have to worry about the updates undoing the security changes that you apply with the actual script to apply them. In addition to that, though, there are changes that take place on our actual configuration here that are user-based configuration changes. Now, understanding, of course, that HQ local machine is going to be considered a global change, whereas HQ current user or HQ user's default are going to be the actual user account configuration changes. And since the configurations in a Windows 11 system vary between what is available in HKey user and HKey local machine. You have to do both in order to actually lock down the local system. Now, this is where it gets really interesting when it comes to this actual package or this actual listing of registry modifications. You see, when I was going through this, I discovered something in the Windows 11 operating system that apparently has been around since 22H2, but still hasn't really been publicly disclosed to anybody. People really just don't know that this is a feature, and I'm doing air quotes here when I say feature, but it's a feature that's been added, or we should say probably removed or redacted from the Windows 11 operating system that has to do with security of your personal records and data. Now, I want to clarify that the system that we're using right now to run this is a 25H2 system. However, I did roll back to 22H2 on an other system to check to see if these issues still existed on 22H2, and they do. They actually exist on 22H2, 23H2, 24H2, and now 25H2. Microsoft was actually informed of these issues in 22H2, but has decided not to patch the problem. So as we continue to scroll here, you're going to continue to see all of the changes that take place. Now, keep in mind that this is one script. This is one .reg file, and this is nearly 500K in size, which is large for just a text file that's used to actually make modifications on your local system. It's important to keep that in mind because that size, those changes, and everything that takes place, if you were to do this yourself, you would have to probably make a change of about 4,000 variables in the Windows 11 system to have the same level of security that this .reg file can do for you. And there's the problem, because even though you can make those 4,000 changes, most of them you can make in the GUI, the GUI is not actually connected to the registry. Yeah, it's nuts, meaning that if you're in the settings console and you make a change for, say, system variables such as notifications, that actual slide box under the settings console in security doesn't change the registry key that's associated to it, meaning that even though you've turned it off, it's not actually off. And then I started digging further to figure out, well, okay, it's not off, but what does that actually mean as far as security? I mean, you know, it's one thing to not have the ability to turn off notifications. That's annoying. But it's quite a different thing to not be able to turn off AI or Copilot integration to allow it to actually copy your data for, and again, using air quotes, marketing reasons to their infrastructure. And that's when I discovered that those buttons are also not connected to anything. And as a result, what has happened is that when you're in the system and you make these system variable changes in the GUI, they don't actually do anything. What I did was I searched on the Microsoft forums for specific bug fix or bug requests or just reporting information on the bugs in Windows 11 22H2. And this is what I located. If we look, we'll actually see that it's reported that tasks under settings, which is in this location, this HKLM app privacy or HK current user content store, the slider is still enabled, but the apps can't access tasks. GUI is cosmetic, meaning that if you modify the slider in the actual settings console for tasks, it does absolutely nothing. So any of those changes that you make need to be done on the registry level. And here's the kicker. If you make the registry change and you actually do block the ability for tasks to be created automatically by apps without your permission or consent, what you have is the ability to do that through the registry. However, the GUI doesn't show it. In other words, the GUI still shows the slider as active inside of the settings console, meaning that when you make this change, even though the change is made in the GUI, it doesn't actually do anything in the registry. And if you make the change in the registry, it's not tied to the GUI. So it doesn't really show specifically what it is as far as the change that you're making, meaning that there are multiple spots in the settings console that don't actually connect to the registry to make the change, that it's literally just a GUI or a visual change that you're making, but on the back end, the system is still recording your data and providing it to Microsoft. So in other words, they've removed your ability to opt out of securing your infrastructure unless you do it through the registry or group policy. Now, when I dug further into this, here's the sliders that do reflect the registry changes. Again, this was listed on Microsoft's site as the reported bug for 22H2. However, what I found is that in 25H2, this is no longer true, meaning that even though it indicates it's blocked enabled correctly, it's not. So I found that the microphone, the camera, location services, that still works correctly. Those sliders still work correctly. They're actually attached, meaning that if you turn them off, they add the registry key value, and then the system actually turns this stuff off. However, voice activation, screen capture, and AI limitations, or AI text and image generation, which, by the way, could be used with the screen capture service to actually record your desktop and provide that desktop information to Microsoft without you knowing, these aren't actually enabled correctly. If you turn that slider off, that slider stays on or off, doesn't make any difference. It doesn't change the variable in the actual registry, meaning that the registry key still exists for enabled even if you set the AI to disabled, meaning that Copilot will still run regardless of whether or not you turn it off in the GUI in the Windows 11 operating system. So I think the next part of this is we should make those registry changes and then take a look at what the GUI reflects to those changes. Now, rather than looking at my huge script of all the security changes, what I did is I created a breakout script. And in the breakout script for the registry modifications, as you can see, we have a listing of all the variables that would need to take place in order for us to lock down the actual system to shut off or opt out of all of those services that are enabled by default on the Windows side. So we should run this script first as a complete script to see what shows correctly in the GUI, and then we should jump in and take a look specifically at the ones that don't actually show correctly. In other words, the ones that still show as on, does the registry key exist? And then maybe we should reset the machine and take specific interest in the ones that showed still as on, and then flip the toggle on and off and see what actually takes place on the registry side as far as an interaction is concerned. Because my guess is that they've added to this bug on purpose so that way you can't opt out of them doing data collection on the Windows 11 operating system. Okay, so let's jump into this now. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna right click on Start and we're gonna go to Settings. The thing is before I go like super hardcore into this, I do also want to go to System. So that way we could show specifically that this is indeed Windows 11 Pro 25H2. I feel like it's important to at least showcase that, so that way you could see specifically the operating system in question. Let's continue on. So we're going to go again into Settings. I realize I just closed that box. System and Settings is the same thing. But before we go further into this, I'm actually going to drill down and zoom in so it's easier for you to see. Hopefully this is now easier for you to see. I'm going to go to Security and Privacy, or Privacy and Security. Don't mind my dyslexia. And I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to go to Text and Image Generation. And we're going to see by default, Text and Image Generation is turned on. Something that I find important about text and image generation with AI integration is the fact that it could actually interact with other services on your system. Specifically things like screenshot and screen recording, meaning that for, and I'm doing air quotes here again, marketing purposes, Microsoft can screenshot and then use AI algorithm to generate text and images to upload to their actual cloud, meaning that they can record what you're doing on your desktop. Now, whether or not they are doing this is not really the issue. The issue to me is that they have the ability to do this. They shouldn't have the ability to access my desktop. And they sure as heck shouldn't have the ability to watch everything that I do on my desktop. I mean, what if I have financial data opened? What if I have my bank account information on there? What if I have my tax information on there? And then what happens if they leak the data? Because the reality is that Microsoft, over the past couple of years, has leaked millions of records. They've leaked over 35 terabytes of personal data to Russian hackers. It's actually so bad that the US government has stepped in and the FTC has launched a deep investigation into the actual whereabouts of how they're securing the data. Now, to learn that when you make these changes on the system, they don't actually do anything is alarming, to say the least. Let's start with the AI and image integration service to see if that actually makes the change. To do that, I want you to take a look carefully at what we have here. This is a regSZ file. Value equal allow, or allow the consent store of AI information. Now, if we were to modify this and make this value equal deny, this would deny the consent store of AI data on the cloud. Now keep in mind that this particular key is an HKey current user, meaning that this would only affect the user logged in. Now if we wanted to create a global configuration, if we scroll up here a little bit and we look specifically for the AI portion, which we can see here, if we make this all zeros versus all zeros with a 1 at the end, that's the difference between letting app access. So with the 1 says yes, let access, and with the 0 says deny the access. So now that we know specifically where our global settings are, as well as our user settings, let's make the change in the GUI and then jump into the registry and see what these look like. So just to be 100% transparent, in my testing, whether or not this is on or off doesn't change any registry key. It's actually not tied to anything at all. It might as well not exist. But for the sake of testing this, let's shut it off. And we'll see that both settings are now off. Our next step is to right-click on Start, choose Run, and enter in regedit, and hit Enter. The first place we're going to check is the global settings change. Now we selected to shut this off. However, that doesn't change the default profile configuration. So we should have the ability as a local systems change, if we made the change, that slide key, as we can see here, should interface with the registry to this location, this HKey local machine software policies Microsoft Windows app privacy. So that means if we drill down into the actual registry itself, we have HKey local machine software policies, right? Policies. We have Microsoft. So we need to find Windows and app privacy. So if we scroll down here, we have Windows, and you'll note that we don't have app privacy. That means that the key was never created. So we ran the slide, and yet the change never took place on the global setting. However, let's take a look at the HKey current user setting to see if our user configuration changed. All right, so let's take a look now at the user configuration. We can see HKey current user, software, Microsoft, Windows, current version, compatibility, access manager, and then we're going to see consent store and AI. So we're in HKey current user, software, Microsoft. Let's scroll down here. We're going to have to find Windows. There's Windows. We can see current version. And we're going to see capability access manager, which we see. We see the consent store. But you'll note that under consent store, we don't have AI. There is no key for AI, which means that it wasn't created when we went in here and we disabled this, which means that this does absolutely nothing. So we could go back in here now and we could refresh, and we still don't have AI because this slide button does absolutely nothing. The connection between the GUI and the registry where the changes should take effect, there's no link. The link between these two items does not exist. Which means all those people out there that think that they've disabled AI, that think that they've disabled settings in Windows 11 are gravely mistaken. All those settings are still active because the default in Windows configuration is on, meaning that you could go into the GUI until you're blue in the face and it won't actually shut anything off. So if we do on or off, we could see again, it makes zero difference in our configuration because, again, we're not actually linked. Now, we could go another step here. We could apply the policy configuration changes that I wrote into the new GTS Unsuck Windows 11 package and apply all of them and then take a look at the GUI to see how that interfaces with what the changes have been selected for the actual given configuration. So in other words, if the configuration is disable location, does it show it correctly in the GUI? Let's take a look at that now. Before we dig a little further into this, I do want to showcase or at least explain that in the configuration, there's also 2 additional registry keys that exist for AI. However, they are not integrated to that particular portion of the settings location. Specifically, I'm talking about Copilot integration. So Copilot integration uses two different registry keys. Unfortunately, both of those registry keys still exist under the application configuration or app privacy key, which we already looked at, and the key just doesn't exist, so the subcategories don't exist. However, those should automatically be created when you slide that selector inside of the actual settings, because at least in my testing for that portion, it appears that that at least is linked to the registry. However, the vast majority of the settings in 25H2 are not linked to the registry. First thing we're going to do here is the transparency portion, which is, I like to show everybody specifically what it is that we're looking at. So if we open this up, now it's kind of misguided because it looks like this is short, but as soon as you click on this, you're going to see that it's absolutely enormous. And the reason why is because there's a lot that goes into configuring Windows 11 to make Windows 11 function correctly. And by correctly, I mean securing the data for you. Not for Microsoft, but for you. Basically cutting Microsoft off at the knees and having them be removed from the equation when it comes to storing your data. And from blocking them to have the ability to access your data. I don't think the requirement for this configuration would be totally justified if the GUI actually worked correctly with the registry. But since it doesn't, there's really no way around it. You have to registry edit the system to secure it at this point. When this is officially released again, it will be in an executable that you could just run like the previous beta package. However, at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to close this and we're going to right click on this guy, do show more options and choose merge. When prompted, we'll hit yes, and then yes, and then okay. And you'll note that this looks a little funky. It's because there's changes that require a reboot. But once again, because it's not an executable and the package hasn't been created yet, we're not at that point. So what we're going to do is we're going to reboot the system. And when it comes back up, we'll jump through the registry and check to see what sliders actually work with the registry and what do not. Okay, so we're back up and running. As you can see, we have the GTS unsucking security warning. And then the welcome to GTS unsucking security package for Windows 11 25H2. So we'll hit OK. Now, as you can see, we're in the actual operating system. Everything still looks like it's intact. And the reason why is it is still intact. At this point, we haven't run the performance portion of this actual script. This is just the configuration to make it secure. Meaning that you could keep all of the apps that were preloaded on the actual Windows operating system on it and still secure it so that way the outside can't see the data. Basically change the default location for all your saves to your local documents, pictures, and video locations. Making sure that, Defender works correctly, that the Windows updates are not intrusive and work correctly. Making sure the feature packs and roll-ups and everything integrate correctly. So in other words, can we upgrade from this to like when 26H2 comes out without having to rerun everything? All of that is what this script does. And I'll say script loosely because right now it's just a reg file. However, when it's done, it's a reg file and a series of bat files because it's going to run this and then it'll reboot the system. So let's jump into here now. Now that the start menu is back in its normal left-hand side, we're going to just right-click on this thing. We're going to go to settings. Once we're in settings, we're going to go over here to privacy and security, and we're going to start to drill through these things and actually take a look. So if we go to general, you'll see everything's off with the exception of the show apps. There's no way to turn this off. Unfortunately, even if you do shut this off, as soon as it reboots, it will still turn back on. The reason why is because the notification settings in the settings app is defined to just specifically show you if there's something terribly wrong in Windows. And also, because I do have notifications still turned on for Defender, meaning that if you get a virus, it'll still pop up and let you know you have a virus, you do need some of this crap to still be left on. You'll note that it does say when this is off, the required notifications are still shown. It doesn't make any difference. It has to be on. It's unfortunately just a side effect of needing certain notifications turned on for antivirus and things of that nature. There's also a pop-up that'll occur probably once. If I'm guessing, I believe it's every Tuesday at like 3 o'clock in the morning, a pop-up will be shown on the bottom right-hand side of the screen indicating that the system may need to be rebooted for Windows updates. But it's not going to nag you. It's not going to give you 50 million pop-ups or the ads or all the other garbage. So that's all this other stuff that's turned off. Let's go back to privacy and security. We have speech. See, that's off. So that means that that works. Linking. So custom inking and typing dictionary. I didn't touch this. I left this alone. It's really a language thing, and I don't want to mess with language variables in a Windows operating system that might be used by people outside of the US. Also, if you've ever used Microsoft Word, Word can be really annoying with spell check. Sometimes you have to add certain words to the actual dictionary. For instance, maybe you work in technology. It doesn't know what DNS is. It's going to underscore that and alert you that DNS is not spelled right or suggest words that it could be. I always add that as a custom portion of the dictionary. I didn't really want to mess with that, so that's still turned on by default. Let's drill into security again, continue on. So we have diagnostics and feedback. You'll see all of this stuff is off. The reason why is because we don't want to provide Microsoft anything, so it's all off. Also, again, since we ran the registry changes, every registry change that we ran should show the exact change as it is inside of the operating system. That's the point of going through this. Let's go back to privacy and security. Go to search. We'll see that search history is turned on. It is. But you'll note that things like searching from Microsoft, Bing, and everything else is turned off, meaning that if you go into the start menu and you search, it's going to search your local computer. It's not going to search the internet for things that are not on your local computer. It's really frustrating to me, right? When I click on start and I want to search for like 7-zip, because I just don't remember whether or not I installed it on this particular machine, and then I click on it and it opens a web page to install 7-zip, that's annoying. I just want to know if it's on the machine. So setting this like this shuts that off. And we'll see here the default folder location. Notice how everything's local. It's because I changed that from the OneDrive garbage. I don't want OneDrive. If I wanted OneDrive, I would install OneDrive, but it shouldn't be on by default. All this does is it opts you out. You could still install it all if you want to. You could still opt in. You're not locked out from making changes. All it is it opts you out from the get-go and allows you to opt in what you want to opt into, which is what it should be. So we go back to privacy. Let's go to location. Notice how location is off. Now we have a location override still turned on. However, this is the first caveat. This is set as off in the registry. This button doesn't do anything. The same thing with the notify when apps request location. It's on, but it doesn't do anything. You can turn it on, turn it off. It doesn't make any difference. It's not actually connected to the registry. Let's go back to privacy and location. Let's go to camera. All this stuff is turned off. Again, if you want to turn it on and let apps access things, you could turn it back on. The whole point of this actual project is to make it so you opt out by default. If you want to opt back in individually, you can. If you decide that you want to revert the configuration changes, there'll be a script released for that as well. So you can just double click on that and that'll revert all the changes to let you opt into everything again. And I did that way, just so that way, if you really wanted to mess with this or troubleshoot something that occurs after running it, that you can at least revert some of the changes. Now, I say some because there's a lot of group policy configuration involved here. A ton of group policy configuration involved here. And the policies are not as easy to revert. So once those policies are applied, they're applied. Now, obviously, I could go through and I could write the undo of the policy for every change, but that would probably take longer than I really want to invest into this. So if you run this, you should know that the policy configuration set is set to NIST 800-171 compliance, with the exception of the fact that there are no other servers. So things like waiting for a server for authentication, logging to a server location, changing network mappings, encryption keys, all that stuff has been stripped from those policies, so it'll function in workgroup mode. But all the other stuff is still intact, like FIPS requirements and encryption requirements and shutting off stuff that should never be turned on in the first place. So if we continue on here, privacy, we just did camera. Let's go into microphone. Once again, microphone's all off. Go back into security, go down again, voice activation. Voice activation is all off. Continue on, we'll go to notifications. Notifications are turned on, but they're not. See, all the notification settings in here, these do nothing. They're not connected to anything in the registry. So you can turn them on or turn them off. It makes no difference at all because there's no registry tying between these settings, meaning that if you turn them on, you're still going to get pop-ups randomly about notifications because, believe it or not, these don't do anything. So if we now drill again, did notifications. Take a look at account info. Once again, account info is turned on. And the reason why account info is turned on is because these don't do anything. They're not actually connected in anything in the registry. It's amazing going through this and finding all these because I spent a long amount of time last night, probably about 4 hours, going through every possible registry configuration that would turn these switches off. That includes the group policy setting, the HK current user setting, the HKey .default, which is the default profile settings, and then the global settings from the HKey local machine. It doesn't make any difference if they're on or off. They're not connected or tied to the GUI. So once again, these don't do anything. Even though they're turned off on the machine, the actual sliders don't work. So contacts, believe it or not, this does work, but I did not turn it off. I turned off the let access from contacts from apps. Now the reason why is because some people actually use the integration services of like Android on their actual phones to the Windows 11 operating system. And if you disable that contact access and you have Microsoft Outlook installed, you'll end up with a problem where the contacts won't sync between the two locations, which could cause a problem. And I didn't want to cause that problem for people that use Microsoft Outlook or Microsoft Office products on their Windows 11 system. So this is on by design in the actual application. However, the additional apps is set off. The reason why is because the group policy configuration sets allows the configuration of the actual Outlook app access to the contacts, meaning that's already a trusted application because it's a Microsoft-based application. So there was really no reason to add the configuration to let the apps access your contacts. Now, with that said, if you are running the radios and you want to integrate your Android device with the contacts, you would have to still add this manually and turn that back on. But at least in this configuration, these two switches are linked to the actual registry. So if we drill further, we just did contacts, we'll do calendar. Calendar, same thing. Calendar configuration is exactly the same as contacts. I left that because of the Outlook integration services. We continue on. Once again, we'll go to phone calls. So phone call access, we'll see in here that anyone using this device can choose their apps to make phone calls on this device is on. That's actually off because this slider doesn't do anything. It's not actually linked to anything on the registry. So even though it's turned off, you can turn it on and off here all you want. It does nothing. So if we continue on, once again, we'll get past that. We'll go to call history. Once again, call history. This is turned off, but it's turned on here because it's not linked to the registry. Same thing we're going to see here with email. These two switches do nothing. Tasks is an interesting one because not only do these do nothing, but they don't actually integrate to the task manager on the actual system. So you can't integrate that or task scheduler, meaning that even though task scheduler might have customized tasks in it and these two switches are off, it doesn't change the fact that there's customized tasks and they still run. You have no way to modify the task scheduler or task manager through this actual GUI and settings because it doesn't do anything at all. Now, I do want to point out that there is an app location in the actual Windows 11 operating system. And that app location is an actual controller, meaning that the data is pumped into I think it's a JSON file. And that configuration file contains what these slides are set to. And that file is supposed to update the database to those changes. But since we could see that these slides do nothing, it is plausible that they are updating the JSON location, but the JSON location may have an error that we can't see, and that as a result, it's not actually updating the registry configuration that's associated. So it might be relatively easy for Microsoft to fix this issue, but since it has now gotten worse from 22H2, I don't have much hope that that'll happen. Messaging's another one. These are both off in the registry, but again, because the GUI is not connected, at least not past the JSON configuration, it doesn't actually do anything. Radios half works, meaning that radios is turned on by default. In my configuration, I didn't touch it. However, I did test it to see if it actually does work, and it does not. So you can't actually turn the radios off, meaning that like things like Bluetooth or wireless access for that matter, you can't disable them. If you try to do it through here, it doesn't work. You can add the registry keys manually to do it, but the slider doesn't actually work. That said, I didn't modify this because There are people who are going to use Bluetooth keyboards and mice. I didn't want those things to magically just disappear. There are also people that are going to use wireless access, like a wireless radio to connect to their wireless internet. I really didn't want that to happen either. What I did make the change for, which you can see in the actual screen here, is the Let Apps Control Device radios, because I don't necessarily want to allow remote access into my wireless access internet through an app that I don't know has access to it. In other words, if some app wants to connect to the internet over the wireless and I have my wireless disabled and it turns the radio on itself to do so, I'm not a fan of that, so that's now set to off, which does show correctly in the GUI. However, the default one, which is the on or off for the actual radio control access, that's not connected or linked to anything. Another one here is the communicate with unpaired devices, so devices that don't actually have explicit access to your system. This does nothing. You could turn it on and off all you want. It may update that JSON file, but it doesn't actually do anything on the other end. So right now it is actually disabled. However, you could turn it on, turn it off, and there is no connection. So if I turn it off and then turn it back on, it doesn't actually modify the registry location that's been modified. In other words, if I have a 0 there and I turn it on and that changes it to a 1, it doesn't change the registry to the 1. It still stays as to whatever the configuration is set through on the actual registry setup. So moving on, we're getting there, I think. So we have app diagnostics. These, again, both of these things are turned off, but there is no connection between here and the registry. Automatic downloads of files are blocked. They are blocked by policy. There is no way for you to turn them back on. There's a reason why they're blocked. It's because you don't want the system to randomly download or upload files, and that's the configuration. In the configuration of the registry, it's defined that if you have this on, it's not just download to you, but Microsoft counts downloading your data to their cloud as a download, not an upload. So if you turn this on, the apps will automatically upload to your OneDrive. Again, if Microsoft secured their infrastructure, this would be a no big deal. But the reality is putting personal data, things that are in your My Documents, on a location that they can't seem to secure is a security risk. Here's another one, which is documents. And it's the same for documents, pictures, and videos, so I won't go through every single one of them, but these are all turned on. They're not in the registry, they're turned off. So obviously, file system access is a questionable one. And the reason why is because you do need the applications to have access to the file system. However, you don't want random third-party applications to have access to your file system. So these are actually configured through a policy setting. So yes, they are on, but yes, they're also off. They're on in the sense that they allow you as an administrator to install the file or the application and then grant the permission based off of that application's requirement. So in other words, if you try to install something and that application requires you to be an admin to run it, it'll install it with that intention to run it as an admin. However, if you install an application and then that application decides to download something and that application tries to execute something, the policy will block it. It'll require you to approve it before it actually installs it. So yes, this is on, but it's also off. The thing is the way the switch works is if any of that portion of the configuration is on, it's on. If any of that portion of the configuration is off, it's off. The problem is inside of the GUI that we're looking at, because there is no connection between the GUI and the registry for some of these things, they're a little confusing as to what actually works and what doesn't. And then it gets even more confusing because if you look at things that are configured in the sense that, all right, we're going to configure it so that way it only has like 50% access, Microsoft doesn't see it that way. They see it as, okay, it's turned on. So the GUI would show it being on. Even if it is working correctly or isn't working correctly, you wouldn't have any real way to decipher between one or the other unless you started drilling into the registry keys themselves. If we move down again, we're past the files now, going into our screenshot and borders. So all of this is disabled. Again, this is the JSON error again. Since this is all disabled, this should all be off, but it's not because, again, the GUI is not linked to the registry for this particular option. This goes down again. We could go down to our end here, which is our text imaging, and we will see this is off. Now, the reason why this is off is because the policy configuration, the registry configuration, and the HKey user configuration are all inside of that script, meaning that it's off because it is tied to one of those three settings. As far as I can tell, it is the group policy setting. It's not tied to the other two configurations of disabling the actual service or the function for it to run. So even if you disable the function for it to run by using this on-off thing, the on-off actually controls the group policy section of the system or the policy section of the actual registry. It doesn't modify or change the other locations that are necessary to actually shut it off. So even though the policy says this is off, don't share this, it doesn't mean that it won't actually still interact with applications like Copilot to upload that data to the cloud, because by default, this doesn't have the full permissions control to the registry to make the changes necessary in order for you to secure the operating system from this running. Now, as I go through this further in the actual package and the build out, obviously there will be beta portions of this, which I'll probably release on the actual GenericTechSupport website. So that way you could grab them and just check them out if you want. There will be a full build out on the actual GenericTechSupport website as far as each one of those registry keys and what they control and what they do. So that way you have an itemized list of the processes if you want to just grab that as a script and then take a la carte specific setting changes that you want to run on your own system. That's totally fine. Or you'll have the ability to download an executable, and that exe file will contain all of the settings that we just went over here, and then probably some more, because as I dig through this operating system and come to the realization of just how terrible it is as far as a build and lacking just common sense security, it really is something that is going to take some more time and effort into the actual build process to figure out what we could do to secure the operating system. I should also let you know that in the security portion, beyond security, I will also be releasing the performance aspect or the debloat portion of this, which is the removal of things like Copilot, Microsoft Edge, and then reconfiguring the Defender antivirus. The reason for that is probably pretty simple, which is if we talk about Defender, there's no reason for Defender to scan Copilot folders or Microsoft Edge folders if those two applications are no longer present on the actual operating system. My ultimate end goal for this entire build is to get it to run on 128 megs of RAM and 2 cores. And I don't mean function, I mean run. And that's probably a big ask from an operating system that requires 4 cores and 4 gigs by Microsoft's minimal recommended support. But I want to have the ability to do that. And the other thing I'm also working on is the trusted platform module portion, trying to figure out specifically what's tied to that, because if we could strip the requirement for the trusted platform module, there should be no reason why you can't just run this on a Core 2 Duo processor. Ultimately, it would be nice to be able to get it to the point where it will run on hardware that was originally designed for Vista or Windows 7. And the reason I say that is because we don't have the ability to run this as a 32-bit. There is no 32-bit platform any longer for Windows 11. That dies with Windows 10. So you need a 64-bit processor in order to run this. But the goal is to get to that very early, even if it was like an Athlon processor that was technically 64-bit. It'd be really interesting if we could get this to run cleanly on an Athlon processor and 128 megs of RAM. And then keeping in mind that those machines probably also had an IDE drive, and not having that IDE drive pin, which is going to take some more massaging of the operating system to get it down to those numbers. But I am actively working on it. And hopefully Microsoft sees this video and they actually fix the GUI, because having this misguided of understanding of specifically what it is that these sliders actually do is a problem, because I don't think it's being forthcoming or transparent as to what it is that the end users really want. Because I think when you go in here as an end user and you slide and turn off AI, it should turn off AI. It shouldn't just turn off a portion of AI. It should completely disable AI. And the fact that they don't give you the ability to do that easily through the GUI and make you jump through basically 50 different menus is kind of ridiculous. There's really no reason for that. They could just as easily add a single toggle on the top that says opt out, which turns everything off and allow you to go in and choose a la carte what you want to turn on. And then maybe generate a pop-up that says if you turn this on, it's going to turn on these other services because maybe they're dependencies. But the problem is they don't disclose that information. So as a result, you end up with a system that you think you're turning things off and you're really not. And that's unfortunate because I think that's deceptive. Be curious what your guys' reaction is to this. Throw something down in the comments and let me know, because to me, this seems like a deceptive process and one that I would probably avoid. Let me also know if you think it's nuts that there's literally 8,052 lines in this actual registry configuration change in order to get this system to not only be secure for your data, but also semi-function a lot more closely to the Windows 7 ideal than what we're currently dealing with. And then lastly, obviously, now that you've seen these changes and what you have to go through to actually disable the configurations in this operating system, assuming Microsoft never actually fixes the GUI, is it worth having a package like this that will actually secure the configuration and allowing you to opt out of the settings versus requiring you to opt in with no way to opt out? To that, I'd really be curious as well if you have any thoughts on that. Leave something down in the comments. Please just leave something down in the comments, at least for the algorithm, so that way this video gets a little more traction. I think it's important for people to know what is actually going on.